Just can't get rid of me that easily, huh? Hey there, hunters, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today, or actually yesterday, depending on when this video gets out, we had a new patch for Remnant 2, which did fix and change a few things. Feel free to read the patch notes in the description below, but there were 3 lines that we're looking at and going to be playing with today. Well, 2 really. I'm just going to kind of glaze through this last one. But basically, they did fixes to Chain Reaction, the Visionary, Invoker's Prime, and to the Dark Matter Gauntlets. Now, a similar fix happened to both Visionary and Chain Reaction, so I want to get to those and explain what's going on before we jump into the builds. So what was happening before with Chain Reaction was that it was refunding 50% of the cost of the mod that you used and refunded it to your stowed mod. However, this was considering things like mod reduction costs. So if your mod cost 800 mod power to use originally, but you reduced it down to 500, you'd refund 250 mod power with Chain Reaction. That makes sense, right? But now you're going to refund the base cost of the mod. So your mod that originally cost 800 is now going to refund for 400, which is insanely better because that lets us able to run basically any mod swapper build now, even with reduced mod cost items on. So the mod swapper builds, which I had already covered, are now much better, and I've already updated those in the builder with links to reflect that. So please go check out those videos and those links. But as you can see here, we're pushing almost 10k DPS. And we don't have to worry about dropping our mods ever again. It's amazing and pretty overpowered. So next, regarding Visionary, which is going to be our first build that we're going to talk about. Basically in the same aspect, Visionary perk got fixed so that it reduces skill cooldowns by 10% of their base cooldown. Before, if you had 80% cooldown reduction, which is the cap, which made a skill that had a 50-second cooldown go down to 10, would basically make it so that you would take 1 second off every time you used Visionary. So, 10% off 10 seconds, okay, fair enough. But now it takes off 5 seconds because it's 10% of the base skill cooldown. However, this opened up Pandora's box to infinite skill usage, because now you can hit the 80% base skill cooldown cap and then have Unbridled as your legendary fragment, which reduces your cooldowns by another 50%, which effectively is reducing your cooldowns by 90%. Because you still have 20% skill cooldown, so you get half more of that, so you have 90%. Yeah, anyway. So your 10-second skill cooldowns become 5 seconds in this case. And so now that Invoker's Visionary restores 5% skill cooldown on use, well, guess what? You just restored that last 5 seconds on skill use. So you effectively have 100% skill cooldown reduction, allowing you to spam any skill in the game. Besides Overclock, because that's still not its skill. And so basically that's the premise of this first build we're going to talk about today. Infinite skill spam. So I'll preface this by saying I don't expect this to last. We have had 100% skill cooldown reductions before in the past, and while it's technically not a bug or an exploit, which is why I'm going to do the build around it, it's probably not going to last all that long. That being said, it's still super fun, and it's not even overpowered, but let's get into this anyways. So the first build here we're going to look at is the better of the two. This is Invoker Ritualist Infinite Eruptor. Invoker is mandatory for this to work, so we kind of got to rock Invoker. Plus, Wave Kayula is my favorite skill, so we're just going to do more Kayula spam here and there as we move through our zones for boss rush. But our real power comes from the Eruptor spam, since we do have infinite uses of Eruption. And the DPS is very solid for the minimal effort required. It sits at about 5.5k DPS without weak spots or aiming, which is respectable, but obviously not anything to gawk at. But the Eruptor spam does provide us with some other niche features that we typically don't get in a build. Firstly is that we have AoE coverage, which is insanely good. You can spam Wave Kayula as much as you want. You can just fill the entire zone with lightning and kill any enemies that step in, even through walls. Like Wave Kayula just obliterates everything. And also we have Eruption that also goes through walls and just taps everything for 400 damage at a time. And you can clear out basically all the trash in 1 or 2 taps. You don't even need to see them. You can just start walking and tapping and everything's going to be deleted. If we see an Elite or an Aberration, we can just throw a Sparkfire shot on them to get some bonus damage from Eruptor and continue hammering the air. We also get stagger resistance. While you're casting a skill, you can't actually be interrupted by most attacks. Not all, but most attacks. So this allows us to upkeep our DPS without ever really having to stop, and we also don't need to invest into any sort of stagger resistance, which is excellent for our sustained DPS, which when paired with the no weak spot to no aiming required, it makes us feel a lot better than you'd think, given the relatively low DPS. This also means we can effectively face tank bosses, as we're really not going to move all that much, and you don't have to worry about our weight or dodging, so you're free to run full Letos for fat damage reduction, and you're going to be a-okay. The only time you're going to be interrupted is in between the skill casts if you're not quite perfect on your button presses, but like I can spam through Ravager's entire roar, so yeah, it's pretty good. So we already talked about Invoker, and while we have Ritualist here as well, this is just for Eruptor spam. We don't really use much of anything else on this kit. Like, yeah, sure, we have dots, but that's basically just giving us damage like any other normal archetype. If you want to run Summoner, you can run Summoner, or we already do Invoker Summoner with Sack Summoner. That's great, do it. Check out my builds on that. But you can run any other archetype you want if you want to just do Kaola spam as much as possible, which is honestly almost just as effective. Wave Kaola just doesn't reach some bosses like Eruptor does. Other good choices though would be you can run Medic for 100% shields on demand whenever you want. You can run Alchemist for always having Stone Skin Potion or Frenzy Dust, and you can swap to and fro those pretty easily. Or you can even run like Invader for infinite wormhole movement. Like, you're pretty free to do whatever you want. And remember, Kaola is still really strong. But like I said, we're going to do like Invoker Ritualist here, so we're going to move on with that. For the weapons here, you can use whatever you want since we're going to be using a skill damage build. I've opted to run Sparkfire and Nebula for just dot application. We need as much application in as little time as possible, so we're going to run Nebula for our corrosion, and Sparkfire with charged wounds and abrasive rounds to get burning, bleeding, and overload. Of course, there are many other ways to get all your dots on enemies. Feel free to do whatever you want with that, just make sure you're getting your 4 dots on. And of course, we're running feedback on Nebula just to get some of our mod refund. But again, if you have any other setups that you like to use, feel free to use that instead. For our trinkets, we need to make sure we have 80% reduced skill cooldown, so I'm going to be using Legacy Protocol for the neck and Black Pawn Stamp Ring. I would like to use the Jester's Bell for increased cast speed because that's insane DPS, but that would require us to run the 2 Burden Rings, Rebel and Stargazer, to reach our 80% skill cooldown cap. And while you can, Stargazer will also then eat 15% of your HP with every skill cast, and that can get you killed if you're spamming your skills a lot. So just to be safe, we're not going to be running Burden of the Stargazer, and instead we're going to run Kinetic Cycle Stone, which is still going to help our DPS with increased cast speed, just not as much. The last pair of rings here we have is Wired Inhibitor to get our slow application, which can be a pain to upkeep because it's only going to last like 3 to 5 seconds depending on what you applied. But it's a pretty easy way to get slow on our target, which does boost our Eruptor damage as it scales with, your 5 negative status effects. And then lastly, we're going to run the Ahane Crystal for the 25% damage, as we actually want skill damage for Eruptor, not dot damage specifically, so things like Shadow of Misery are pretty bad. And this is going to give us the most damage since we are going to be running our 5 statuses anyways with Eruptor. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of ways to get like cast speed or skill damage, so we're pretty limited on our choices here. But you can also choose to just not run Wired Inhibitor if you're going to get slow on another source like Stasis Beam or Song of Earfur or whatever, and then go with some other rings like Burner the Destroyer. Moving on to the Prism, which is going to be a bit more specific. We have the Unbridled here as a legendary fragment, which is for our 50% skill cooldown reduction, which is 100% mandatory. Then we have the Fusions. We're going to run Meta for the crit damage, Revitalize for the skill cooldown, Wizard for skill crit, and Flash for cast speed. The 4 fragments we're running are skill damage, skill cooldown, skill crit, and cast speed. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. We need the cooldown fragments and the legendary to get a 100% skill cooldown cap, and then the cast speed is huge boost for our DPS because obviously animations cost a lot of time. But the meta and the crit here is pretty unnecessary. We don't have a whole lot of crit, so it's not that helpful. So don't feel like you need like a perfect prism or the same prism I have. You can also run tank stuff like Hulk and tank fusions. Pretty good option in place of wizard or meta as well. For the traits, we have to have expertise for skill cooldown, of course. Amplitude is great for our AoE size. I'm going to say that's pretty much mandatory. And from there, you're pretty much free to go. I slapped on Siphoner and all my standard defensive traits since we're going to be face tanking bosses. And rather than use swiftness or any movement traits here, I opted for leech trait since we have a lot of leech already. And 50% more leech is pretty solid and feels like a safer bet, to be honest. Lastly, don't forget to drink a Xenoplasm concoction for 10% skill cooldown reduction. And from there, you're pretty much good to go to just spam Wave, Kaola, and Eruption. You can face tank bosses, but be careful as there's still some attacks that can kill you, like Nightweaver's Orbs shotgunning you. And on the higher tiers of Boss Rush and the Gauntlet, some modifiers like Detonator can be very scary, so watch out for those. But otherwise, it's pretty safe. Now, the build, is it amazing? Yeah, kinda. The DPS is excellent for the effort and the safety it provides, and it feels extremely safe and effective just so long as you don't try to compare boss kill times. 6k DPS at best isn't amazing for a pure DPS perspective, but it's certainly enough. Now again, I don't expect this build to last all that long. 100% skill cooldown is certainly an overlooked outcome for fixing Invoker, and bypasses that hard cap of 80% that Remnant 2 has. So don't expect this to be around forever, but go ahead and use it while you can because it's not a bug and it's not an exploit. And just remember that any skill works. You can use whatever skills you want. Infinite Sidewinder, infinite resurrections, whatever. Now that being said, we can pivot to a build that is patch proof and certainly still very fun. Now in the patch we also got a change to the Dark Matter Gauntlets that allows the laser beam to count as a charged melee attack now, which is great since it'll proc things that activate on charged melee hits like Butcher's Fetish, Shocker Mutator, and well, most mutators. So there's actually a lot you can do now with the gauntlets. So now we're going to try to make a Dark Matter laser build that doesn't involve abusing the Boar exploit for the double hits because we ain't about that life. So instead, this is going to be my Warden Challenger Dark Laser build. Now the footage of this build is actually not the final version of the build that I'm going to be posting in the builder. I had made some changes after the fact to make it comfier, but it's still the same general setup, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Now, I'm going to go with the Warden Prime for this melee build because the idea is that I want to be as tanky as reasonably possible so that I can use the Dark Matter laser and just face tank anything in my way through the entire dungeon or boss fight. Because of this, we're going to be running Warden Prime with the shield drone to give us a lot of survivability with the extra shields and damage reduction, but more importantly, the one free stack of Boar we get. Pretty much everything here is just defensive, and while I would typically run something like Alchemist for extra concoctions and the skills like Frenzy Dust, we actually don't need attack speed on this build because it doesn't increase the tick rate of the Kill Nova laser. So there's not very many archetypes that's actually going to support this build, but if you want, you can still run Alchemist with Stone Skin, it's still a good option. You can run Medic with the shield as well. I'm just running Warden because I've never used Warden in a build before, and it does give one free stack of Bulwark. Now Challenger should be a no-brainer. We're using this for Juggernaut for that 50% melee damage, and the strong back trade's pretty good as well. Not necessary, but still very good. Again though, you're free to use something else like Alchemist or Medic or even Ritualist for Death Wish. For the weapons, we're running Nebula as pretty much a staple for us at this point, and the damage isn't terrible. And of course we still want that Corroded. We're also going to be running any long gun that you want paired with the Ring of Spears mod so we can get a little bit of mod scaling through our melee damage. Plus Ring of Spears is going to trigger our melee mutator for us as well. Our weapon of course is going to be the Dark Matter Gauntlets. That's the whole point of the build. We're doing the laser spam. And the mutator is actually now open to a lot of choices. I tried Shocker and it's fine, but the DPS increase wasn't all that impressive, so I decided not to run it. Instead, I'm actually going for Shielded Strikes because I'm already running Warden, and the shields will grant me a ton of effective HP, and since the laser counts as charged melee now, it generates shields on every single tick, which is enough to keep us alive as we laser down bosses. Paired with the Ring of Spears, which also is going to be triggering our Shielded Strikes, it's going to give us a lot of shields. So I think the synergy there is pretty good. Now you can also run Steadfast Mutator to convert all the damage you take while using your laser into gray HP, and then run Rally Band to be restoring that with every tick, which is basically another way you can become immortal during laser spam, but I'm going to go with shields. I haven't done a shield build yet. Moving on to the trinkets. The amulet is pretty set in stone. Butcher's Fetish is a must-have for melee builds, especially now that the laser tick counts as charged melee, and so it's always going to be active during the laser. The rings are open to change, that's for sure. I'm using Bisected Ring here, which isn't in the clips. I don't think the increased damage taken is all that bad, and the infinite stamina solves a lot of problems with melee builds, and it makes it so we don't have to use concoctions and consumables to sustain our stamina. So it's just a more consistent bet. Now Demolition Coil is a must-have here, as all of our laser ticks count as unarmed for these gauntlets, and so they do explosions on every tick, which gives us a 30% multiplicative modifier, so yeah, easy inclusion there. We're also running the Tarnished Ring because it's 30% unarmed damage, which is the biggest boost we can get on a ring slot. Now you could instead run the Meteor Shard Ring for 50% unarmed damage, and then run the Dull Steel Ring to bring you back down to heavyweight, which would be effectively the same as running like Haymaker's Ring and Tarnished Ring, 2% difference there, but you could do either of those. You could also run Burden the Gambler instead, and I know the weak spot damage on Kill Nova laser is insanely strong, and that's a huge part of the damage for the build. But hitting a weak spot with a Kill Nova laser without Boar is insanely difficult. The hit registration is pretty bad, and it's jank because if you hit a non-weak spot and then move the laser to a weak spot, it's never going to count it as a weak spot anyway. It's weird and inconsistent, so even with bosses that have good weak spots, there's a good chance you're not always going to be hitting those. So I don't think Gambler is a bad option. It is just a decent option. Don't feel like you need to use it, but I mean, if your boss doesn't have a weak spot anyways, you might as well put it on. Also, Sealed Resin Loop is a good option for safety so you can cancel out of the laser animation, but I found that this makes things incredibly janky and I didn't like it. It felt like it was auto-canceling some of my charges and some of my attacks, and everything just kind of felt more inconsistent with inputs, so I don't know, maybe it's a skill issue here, but I didn't like it. I think it causes more problems than it fixes. Still a good option though, not for me. Anyway, moving on to the Prism, we're running Immovable here as our legendary fragment because it gives us stagger immunity, and that's why we have Warden Prime for that 1 free stack of Bulwark, so we always have Bulwark, and so we're always stagger resistant. Challenger and Alchemist can provide us with Bulwark and stagger resistance, but that's all temporary, and this also will save us a trinket slot so we don't have to fit Bulwark somewhere else. For the fusions, we have Tank and Hulk for that added defense, and then we have Warrior and Rogue for melee damage and melee crit, with 2 crit damage fragments, melee damage, and melee crit as our last little fragments. We don't need melee attack speed here since again it doesn't affect our laser tick rate, but it's not a bad option if you have a Prism already with melee speed because it still gets you to charge faster and clear faster with normal charge attacks, so don't feel like you have to redesign the Prism if you have attack speed. For the traits, we're going to be running a lot of tank stuff here, pretty much standard at this point. Bark Skin, Vigor, Fortify, Siphoner, the usual. We also have Chakra to sustain our mods a bit longer, but you can also run Arcane Strikes too for increased mod generation. We have Amplitude for a bigger AoE size on our laser and demolition coils so we can have a bigger splash damage, as well as increasing our Ring of Spears circle to touch more enemies to get more shield. Lastly, we have Preservation to hold on to our shield for a little bit longer, but this isn't necessary at all. Something like Insight and Arcane Strikes would probably go further to sustain the shields with Ring of Spears more than Preservation would. And that's pretty much all the gear for the Dark Matter laser build. By no means is this an amazing build for boss clear, not without the Boar exploit, but it's still an incredibly fun build, which is kind of all that matters really. It's great having a melee build that can actually hit every single boss in the game and not have to swap out. Sure, the damage isn't great and the clear speed is rather slow, but that doesn't bother me all that much, especially when it can now compensate for some insane bulk, and we can literally face tank just about every boss and attack in the game since we have over 70% damage reduction, as well as all the shields we have to generate through all our mods and lasers, and because we're Warden. So yeah, it's very safe, it's fun, and it gets the job done. And I think it qualifies it to be a functional build, right? And so it's got my stamp of approval. It's still not better than Harvester's Reach, but range does matter, and since we can now swap between these two builds, we can go through the entire boss rush gauntlet entirely with melee setups, so that's a win. Anyway, that's gonna be all for me. Quick new video for the patch. Don't get attached to the infinite skills, that's for sure. I can't fathom a reason why we'd be able to keep infinite skill cooldowns, but yeah, peace and good luck out there.